Welkom, beste kijkers, bij de volgende aflevering van Café Weltschmerz. Ik ben professor Paul Vrijters in de economie, ook academisch directeur van Nova Academia. En ik heb hier onze internationale gast, Gizzy Foster, waarmee we zo meteen in het Engels een interview gaan doen. We gaan het hebben over One World Government, dus de globalistische overname. En een aantal dingen die daarmee te maken hebben. Dus centrale bankmunten, de EU-propaganda, de moordaanslag op Trump en een aantal andere dingen van zowel recente realiteit als onderliggende factoren. En oplossingen natuurlijk. Gizzy Foster, Professor Gizzy Foster. Welcome very much to the Netherlands and to Café Weltschmerz, one of the premier alternative media channels in the Netherlands and wide. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Paul. It's a great pleasure to be here and to be interviewed by you as well. Somebody I've known for many, many, many years. So I'm sure we'll have a very interesting conversation.
It is wonderful to have you here. And by introduction for our viewers, Professor Gizzy Foster is an economist. She is a professor at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, Australia, where she's had many accolades. She's been awarded for her teaching. She's also been voted best economist by the other economists in Australia.
Just like you.
Under 40, as I remember. And it's been a while.
It's been a while.
It's been a while, exactly. But she's still very active. And in Australia, you might say that she's one of the queens of the anti-lockdown and sort of the anti-authoritarian movement. She's one of the co-founders of Australians for Science and Freedom, one of the initial authors of the Brownstone Institute, and has written several books about the current period, including a cost-benefit analysis of how devastating the lockdown policies were for various groups, of course, particularly our children. Right?
Yep.
So welcome. It's great to have you in the Netherlands, and of course, great to have you involved in Nova Academia. As we're jointly our means of trying to revive the good things about old academia, and as well as keeping the best of new academia.
Absolutely, and I think we deserve to have a bit of a plug for that. Nova Academia, happening at a castle in Thau in Belgium, is really an international venture. Its home is there geographically, but certainly the involvement of a lot of people from Australia, some people from America, and people from Europe makes it truly something that everybody can take ownership of and feel is theirs. So I definitely hope over the years that that's what develops and that we manage to educate a new generation of kids with the Enlightenment values, the critical thinking, the pro-social research, and willingness to steward their own societies that has been lost in a recent generation.
Great. Well, let's get into it. And the main topic that we want to talk about is the sort of the Western globalists, right? Who in various ways in recent months and recent years have tried to take over many levers of power within Western countries, but also the world as a whole. And we want to review a couple of these things and recent developments in that takeover, if you like, right?
Yep.
And I guess one of the main ones are the international health regulations, which I believe still have to pass various parliaments, but look like instituting a new surveillance regime, which will be set up in Berlin with ominous overtures, of course, right? But also would allow a quick calling of new pandemics, forced lockdowns, new vaccine rounds, and basically a quite authoritarian structure. How worried are people in Australia about this? How worried are you about this? Do you see that being resisted? Do you see that working? What do you think is going to happen with that?
Well, Australia, and I suppose we're not alone in the West in having this problem, but Australia has had a problem during COVID of political apathy on the part of the people. People really just want to kick back and have a barbecue and she'll be right. That's sort of the attitude. And so it has been a slow road trying to build an organized, awake resistance, not just ASF, Australians for Science and Freedom, but several other groups in Australia really took a couple years to get going after COVID started. And of course, that was partly because we were physically separated from each other and couldn't talk, but also people felt sort of, well, everything's been going reasonably okay. I haven't needed to devote time from my life towards political activism. Right? That is just not a habit that people in Australia have had, in large part. If they are politically active, it's generally to support one of the major political parties. And we have a two-party system, just like America. And so that is where people will spend their effort, or used to spend their effort. So trying to generate a new movement out of that sort of political apathy and habituation to simply thinking of political activism as being a member of one of the two big parties has been a really difficult thing. Now, in relation to the WHO IHR, earlier this year, there was a movement to unite a bunch of different resistance organizations that are new in Australia, called the Aligned Council of Australia. That was what it called itself, ACA. And if you count all the memberships of all of those organizations together, it will have represented more than 1 million people in Australia. And that organization was built expressly with one goal: resist the WHO IHR. Right? And that was reasonably successful in the sense that it, for about 2 or 3 months, just pushed pedal to metal drops of mailboxes, posters, ads, calling people, writing to politicians, everything they could do, activating their base to get people to have this one purpose. And of course, as you say, I don't think it's dead yet. I think the IHR will come back in a different form. And that's typically the pattern. You know, you don't win in one stroke. There's a sort of a retrenchment and then a reformulation and a representation. We've seen that on, for example, the misinformation, disinformation bill as well, which we had one of in Australia. It's still being tweaked. It got initially pushed back, but now there's, we'll try it differently, maybe different words, and then try again. So I do expect we'll see it again. But if I ask myself, is there a resistance to the IHR in Australia? Yes. Okay. And that organization now, that ACA organization, is trying to now re-identify with what other causes can it help to promote or push or work against. And so I'm somewhat hopeful that that kind of federalist model of a central body organizing a bunch of different resistance organizations, each of which focuses on something different. ASF is the egghead free think tank. There are also vaccine injury groups and groups that are expressly about medical freedom and groups that are new medical networks. That system, I think, is it's a good model, and I hope that it will continue in the future to be successful. Now, in other countries, obviously, we have seen some resistance by the people, but again, you see more resistance, I think, in places that know what repression and totalitarianism look like. So Africa was, I think, one of the first resistors of this whole idea. You know, the countries in Africa have seen recently abuses of power, and they haven't had that period in their lives that we've had in the West of being able to relax and kind of take for granted that things will work out in the government side of things and we can just do our lives. And that's been a real poison pill for us.
So you do think that, as it were, the WHO treaty, the IHR, was partly a takeover bid?
Of course.
And that it didn't quite, as it were, they, whoever they are, didn't quite get what they wanted.
Yep.
But that they are almost banking on winning anyway in the next round.
Absolutely, that's the plan.
And that there's a growing resistance in Australia, because 1 million out of, what, 26 million?
Roughly 26 million,
Exactly. I mean, that's a fair percentage to truly motivate.
And as a percentage of the adults, even higher. No? So it's not too bad. But I will say,
sizable movement.
I will say as well, I mean, the people who are working for this WHO IHR move, I think many of them do not consciously think we want to take over the world. Right? They tell themselves these stories. And this is where the psychological elements come in of what has happened to our societies, particularly over the last few years, but in the elites more broadly. We talk about the big bad elites, and sure, yeah, in terms of the effect on humanity, absolutely. But many of the people who catalyze the actions of the elites do not consciously want to hurt people. They are telling themselves that they are doing the right thing. And you can see the wrapping is basically believed. The wrapping of, we will promote global health. We will,
the One Health program.
Help people. And in fact, we know a colleague, a mutual friend, who worked for the WHO for many years on their anti-malaria campaign. And at the time he was working there, he felt he was doing a good job, and then noticed gradually that the mission seemed to be slipping, and the net effect of this organization started to be negative for humanity. So I think that's a problem as well, is that people in the system...
You're talking about David Bell here.
Indeed.
Also one of the teachers of Nova Academia. And like quite a few of the people who are with Nova Academia, sort of came from within the system, worked for governments, worked with large international organizations, but became disillusioned. But they come from a place of knowledge. They know how it works. They've been at the conferences. They've personally spoken to the people. I mean,
that's right.
Right?
That's right.
We've sort of met all the key players in our lives. And that says we know how bad it is.
No, that's right.
And what we are resisting.
And many of his colleagues still working at the WHO will still be captured by that ideology. There's a psychological habituation. Of course, we're doing the right thing. Of course, we're promoting health. And that's a real problem for team sanity.
Yeah.
Because these people are captured.
And as David is saying, many people who are still within the system, they don't quite believe in it, but it's a job.
It is. That's
and
the
it gives
other
them
problem.
status, and they can't do something else.
That's the other problem.
They grind their teeth, right, and they survive. But they're hoping for a change, almost in the wind, if you like, right? But somebody else must do the resisting.
But that is, yes, that is the way, though.
They will do that.
The change in the wind, I mean, the change in the culture is something that comes about when somebody fights hard enough to create an alternative vision, an alternative system, an alternative approach to organizing social life. And so, of course, that's what we are trying to do. And you're quite right. People like to feel that security of having a job, having a community, having a cause. And unless we collectively present an alternative job, community, cause, where they can get security, it's going to be a tough road.
No, and it's good to talk about alternatives and what's being built, including, of course, Café Weltschmerz,
Absolutely.
which has been around for a long time, building a media alternative. I want to talk a bit more about, as it were, the activity of, we can call it the globalist class, or whoever they are, right? And so the Trump assassination, do you think that there was sort of deliberate slack security, at least, right? That the maximum wasn't done to protect him because it would have been rather convenient.
It would have been, wouldn't it?
It would have been, wouldn't.
Exactly. I mean, it's very hard to escape that conclusion. And I just, what I don't really understand is how the guy missed, right? I mean, it must have been just a very, very opportunistic head roll, right? Head shake. It's just, that seems incredibly lucky. But yes, I don't know how you could look at the facts of that case and think that what he was receiving was the protection that we would normally expect for a serious presidential candidate.
Yes, they didn't give him the A team of protectors,
Indeed,
did they?
It's about the F team, I would say. It's in flunkies.
That's right. That's right. So it's the woke squad. That's right.
Go woke, go dead.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Then an issue which is hot off the button here in the Netherlands. Here in the Netherlands, and which is central bank currency.
Yes.
Right? That is seen as a huge danger, as the coming of the surveillance state, or almost, the inevitability of measuring everything one does with money via central bank currency. Now, do you have that in Australia, of course, and do you fear it as much? What do you think would happen? Can it be resisted? How do you see that?
So we definitely have movement toward a digitization of not just currency, but also identification and sort of interactions with the state more broadly. And it's very easy to sell that to the population in Australia because they're lazy. It seems easy. You can check in with your phone. You can do your whatever business you have easily without filling out paperwork, etc. I do think that many of those efficiencies are overstated. But I also am very much not anti-technology. I think we should try to find out how to use modern technology in ways that promote human thriving. But restricting choice is the problem, in my view. So if you say, well, we must not have cash, we will no longer have coins and bills, for example, to me, that's just an ideological position, A, and B, you're restricting choice. The economic model for a happy, healthy, thriving market is that you have many choices for consumers. So you want to give choice for people to say, oh, I'd like to pay cash for this or credit card for this, or maybe have cash to teach their children how to use money in a concrete way. That's very useful, or give money to the homeless. So I think the restriction of cash is something I really don't like, and I think we should push against. It's like a mandate, right? Mandate not to do X. With regard to digital currencies, I think governments will be will find this very appealing because it's a way to try to increase their tax base, first of all, even though, of course, the main way that they're losing their tax base is not through individual people on the street not using their cards, but rather because large companies are evading taxation. And so you're kind of trying to solve a problem in the wrong field, right? The problem is happening in this field, but you go to this field and spray it with pesticide. That's not going to solve the problem, right? So I think that the states generally will be attracted to it. That's not going to go away. If we want to focus on something, it should be to try to preserve consumer choice and producer choice in terms of what to use. And whether or not it's really truly that dangerous, I mean, the obvious risks are, for example, that the entire system gets hacked, that you have an electrical outage, that there's some other kind of technical failure, somebody's money can just go like this, or the central banking authority that keeps track of all this decides to, as many do who have that much power, to use that power to help themselves rather than helping the community that supposedly it's serving. And so then you can have a kind of control mechanism that comes out of this, where you can't have access to your money unless you have, XYZ behavioral stars next to your name.
Okay.
Recently, I know a friend who has a bank account in California, but lives in Thailand. And he found one morning that the state of California had simply deducted $900 out of his bank account from California because they assumed that he lived in California because he had a bank account there. Now, this is a man who has not lived in the United States for 20 years. So that's an example. How can that happen? How can a state simply say to a bank, right? So that kind of easy use of human resources, hard-earned cash of human beings through these kinds of mechanisms of making it just that much easier, that is definitely dangerous.
And would you also fear, as it were, the Canadian scenario, whereby, remember the truckers?
Absolutely.
They came to the capital, and then
and
the authorities, the authority looked up who they were, and said to the bank, even without central currency, look, stop the bank account of these people.
Well, California doesn't have a central currency yet, as far as I know. So that example I said before happened without the central currency. And of course, I mean, this is the behavioral stars, right? As have you conformed to our list of, required or desired behaviors? Very dangerous again. Right? I mean, who is making that decision?
Well, if central bank currencies come anyway, which is a real danger, because our side has very little political power.
Absolutely.
Right? We must see reality that we're in a position of political weakness. Well, what can people do to nevertheless, have a reasonable life as cash is abolished and central currencies is the only way that they can move officially? What would you do? I know what I would do. I would start trading in Swiss francs.
Exactly.
Or whatever free money there still is.
You choose a different, basically create choice for yourselves. So people imagine when they're in one country that they have to use that currency, they have to use a currency. In fact, you can get a lot done in a community if you have a network with a lot of trust. I give you pumpkins, you give me tomatoes. You can have community-based schooling. You can organize a lot of that stuff in the medium run. You can extract yourself. But more broadly, yes, you can use any currency in the world. And over time, what we would expect, just like with migration, human migration patterns, the money will go to the places where people are able to make choices that are free. So if there is still a country where they've got a currency that's not got this surveillance state aspect associated with it, people will go there, just like the companies go to.
So in a way, you think that central bank currency introduction would almost speed up the search of large parts of the population for alternatives.
Exactly.
Black markets using the currency of still free countries, if you like.
Definitely.
But also people moving to where they can still have greater freedom.
Yes.
So in that sense, it forces things which otherwise would happen in the long term to happen a bit quicker.
It's poison in the well. It's poison in the well.
So it's not just to be feared almost.
No, in some sense it can be helpful in the longer run. Obviously, it is in the short run something people are worried about. And people, unfortunately, you have to have this attitude of courage in our movement, right? And knowing that we are on the right side of history and do not play on the terms of the elites. And so, yes, if they overplay their hand, that will eventually rebound upon them. And trust people to seek their own freedom and their own best life.
Okay. Now, then another topic which you and I have both already discovered personally, but Café Weltschmerz has discovered and lots of other outlets have discovered, which is that of censorship and propaganda,
Oh,
right?
goodness.
I mean, we are like very small voices next to the huge megaphones
Yep.
of what is now called the legacy media, which I kind of like, right? And one of the latest moves in that has been the EU Commission's, as it were, propaganda machine threatening Twitter that if they don't go censorious sufficiently,
Yeah.
then they're going to fine Twitter.
Yeah.
Now, whatever you think of, the sort of the deeper motivations and political networks of Elon Musk,
Yeah.
it's just an outright threat to enforce big companies towards further censorship. Do you think that Twitter is going to lie down? Do you think that in that sense, yes, they are going to be able to muzzle Twitter even more than it perhaps already is, playing ball, if you like? And again, where do you see this going? Because you've been cancelled. I've been cancelled.
Yes,
the organizations have had lots and lots of movement against what.
Yeah. So, I mean, you're right, and cancelled in a sort of temporary sense. So what happened to me, because the audience won't know, I'm not on Twitter, but back in 2020, when I started speaking out against the lockdowns, apparently I was defamed on Twitter, the platform previously known as Twitter. And that, happened just without any, I mean, it was essentially people just as a pile-on, ad hominem attacks and whatnot. And yet, despite that cancellation, I kept my job. I still have, many, many interviews I do every week. I'm on the, some sort of channel, at least a couple times. And I still teach. I still reach young people, not just at Nova Academia, but at the university I'm employed by. I still do my research, and the media, the legacy media, still call me to give commentary on policies, right?
I know, you're the team sanity representative. I've heard you named. That's right. It's not the worst title to have,
It's not so bad. It's not so bad. And indeed, recently, the most recent one, some of the audience may know, was a coverage of vaccine injuries mainly, but sort of a COVID policy retrospective run by Channel 7, which is one of our mainstream channels on the Spotlight program. And that was a great opportunity, and I wasn't canceled away from having that opportunity. So when we say we're canceled,
Well, remember our paper on censorship and propaganda.
Our paper, which has now been published.
Finally, 2.5 years later than it should have been published.
Absolutely,
basically.
absolutely. So, and from the efforts of a well-meaning, courageous editor.
Exactly.
Right? So you need a little bit of luck. You need a little bit of, even the Channel 7 program happened because, as I understand it, many of the employees in Channel 7 are themselves vax-injured, and they managed to stock the audience with vax-injured, and so there was help from the inside. But again, cancellation can only really go so far. Eventually, the sort of vitriol and the anger and the this burns itself out and then goes against someone else or someplace else. And so if you keep trying, and of course there will be people who fall. That happens.
No.
But as a movement, if we keep trying, again, we are on the right side of history. So, and on the question of whether Twitter will fold, from what I have heard of his tweets and his speeches, Musk really cares about this. He really cares about, he just finds it a personal and moral affront to have some big, organization, whatever that organization is, tell him what is okay, what is not okay. And it's a farce anyway. Who decides what misinformation is?
I know.
Just the whole thing is nonsensical. So that I think it will collapse under the weight of its own senselessness eventually. And Musk, I think, is in the vanguard of that. But we also need to keep putting that message out to get people to realize how this may sound good at a surface level, protect your children, less violence, don't show people, nudity, whatever. But in the long run, this weakens our societies. It makes us docile. It makes us controlled.
Well, yeah, we'll see whether Musk gets away with it, because I have seen him threaten on Twitter the EU Commission with, a lot of law cases in which the truth will then be aired.
Yeah.
But of course, what bigger megaphone can he get than he already has? So I'm not sure that the EU Commission will be frightened by that. If they're not frightened by Twitter now, they won't be frightened by court cases, which their media won't cover.
No, that's true.
Right?
But when we say they're not frightened by it, people who have that much power and have managed to push the envelope so far, eventually risk sort of losing the plot. Right?
Yeah.
They
No,
lose
they
track
start
of,
to believe their own nonsense.
Exactly, and they
That's
lose
right.
track of the boundaries of where they can get their, have their
That's
control.
right.
So
how long can you make the world believe that Ukraine is winning?
exactly,
That's right.
exactly. So this is why I say my confidence is that eventually this misinformation, disinformation thing will collapse under its own stupidity, but it will take a while, and there will be battles, and this is a marathon.
And can I push on one thing, particularly the vaccine injury thing, because I know that in Australia, in a way, you can talk about this a lot more openly than in the Netherlands. So you may not know, but in the Netherlands, the whole excess death and vaccine story is incredibly sensitive, and the censorship and propaganda and cancellation is still tremendous.
Wow.
So to take the case of Saskia Mostert, who is has had this great article published in one of the top journals, the BMJ. It was very innocuous. It just noticed a correlation. That's really all it did between, how many people are vaxxed and how many injuries were there on the basis of data which is in the official realm.
Yeah.
But, she now faces potentially being fired because of this, right? The journal might retract it because of the weight of just the sponsors pushing those journals. And here in the Netherlands, this is just omerta, right? You in the mainstream media, this is just impossible to talk about, and so the airways are flooded with the nonsense, right?
Well,
how is that in Australia? Is it a similar sort of totally taboo topic, or is it?
It's definitely. It used to be. It used to be. 2 years ago, I would say 100% it was a taboo topic. And I mean, I have friends who stalwartly supported me, at least in private, on the lockdown thing, saying, yes, lockdowns are not good policy, but on the vaccines, were essentially saying, well, if the unvaccinated die, too bad, right? So, I mean, really nasty. But it has moved. And certainly the Spotlight program is a pebble in the avalanche. There are other pebbles. We have an organization that organizes what they call Forests of the Fallen to crop up in various places. And there was one right outside the Channel 7 recording studio after we did the recording for that program, which essentially is just a bunch of flags, each one with a name of someone who has been grievously injured or died because of or following the vaccine.
Forest of the Fallen.
The Forest of the Fallen.
What a beautiful notion.
Yeah, it is. And it now has had forests that have sprung up and then get taken down in all across all the states and territories of Australia. We had one at the inaugural conference of Australians for Science and Freedom last November in Sydney. It is. And so there is this sort of growing recognition, and the people are genuinely ill in various ways. They genuinely are less physically healthy. I don't know what it's like in the Netherlands, but
it's pretty bad. If you look at the average health statistics, there's a clear deterioration, right? And for reasons that may not be named, as it were, right?
Well, I mean, I think it is important to take a scientific approach to this question. And so, for example, we just narrowly got past a Senate inquiry into excess deaths in Australia a few months ago. And Australians for Science and Freedom put together a submission to this inquiry because public submissions were called. And we didn't just say, it's the vaccines, you idiots. Right? We said, look, in our scientific estimation, there are a number of possible reasons for the excess deaths since mid-2021. Yes, vax injuries and later deaths are part of it, but it could also be the protocols used in hospitals, which we know from the UK example sometimes create more death than saving people. And it could also be the delayed effect of lockdowns, which, as we know, crowded out healthcare and all sorts of things. So we try to take this scientific approach, and truly that is what we need. Independent, sane researchers with no skin in the game to simply apply their statistics skills to the problem.
Who still has no skin in the game at this point? I mean, where do we find the true independent scientists? Somebody hiding in Antarctica for the last 5 years.
That's exactly what I was thinking. Maybe they went on an expedition to the North Pole in 2019. They're just coming back now, and they're a great statistician.
That's right. And who will feed them the stats would be my wonder. So we're economists, and one of the things economists like to do is look at, as it were, deeper patterns which drive stuff, which you don't hear about in the news, but is nevertheless very important. And two of the things that you don't hear much about is this enormous tax evasion by the super rich. And now I'm not thinking of a mere millionaire, I'm thinking of the billionaires, and I'm thinking of the corporations, Apple, Microsoft, the huge oil companies, all of them, right? They're all tax evaders, and their states get very little out of them. And that this affects our countries in a way that the population doesn't understand, because it means that the taxes on them will be increased, the middle class, the upper middle class, the mere millionaires, and there'll be huge pressure on that, or just less education, less health. And so in a way, their country is being eroded because the people with the highest ability to pay are no longer citizens. Right?
No, it's clandestine rape.
Where do you see clandestine rape? Wow. Where do you see this go? I mean, this is like the top of society is no longer part of us. Are they our overlords now? Are they?
Oh, well, that is the style of society that we have stumbled into. We've called it ourselves neo-feudalism.
Neo-feudalism.
Right, we've used that phrase in our own blogs, and that is, it feels like that for a lot of people. And
that's the peasants.
Peasants, and that's supported by their own psychology. That's the frustrating thing for someone who is trying to build a better world, who remembers what it was like back in the heyday of the West. I mean, we sort of were just on the edge of that in Generation X. And, and we want people to recognize that you can have a better life if you raise your sights and take charge and live on your own terms. And you have the right to set your own terms. These are Western democracies. We use that word for a reason. It's supposed to be the people's voice that directs resource allocation and resource redistribution within the group, rather than the voice of well-connected people who manage to hire financial gurus who will tell them where to hide their money in order to evade their fair share being paid.
And who write the regulations accordingly.
Exactly. In the government, they're partners.
So, I mean, do you see that group of overlords ever being brought back into society, or will they destroy each other? I mean, where are they going to get away with this? Where do you see that go?
I mean, that's not an easy question. They have so much power still at this moment, and in a way, I think we just have to be vigilant and patient and keep fighting and pressing against and come up with new ideas that may appeal to citizens who gradually wake up. So one of the things that we've discussed in the past about taxation, for example, and this is in contrast to, for example, Thomas Piketty's proposal that we should have a global minimum corporate tax. Problem with that, somebody's going to renege, right? And as soon as someone reneges, that's where all the companies go.
And which super global power is going to enforce that?
Well, exactly.
I mean, it's this
that's why there'll be a
fantasy.
renege, right? Right? So you can't possibly make that work, right? But he recognizes at least that there is this problem.
He recognizes the problem and then fantasizes the power to solve it.
Yes, but let's not be too denigrating towards people who are at least seeing the problems. So another solution that we have discussed is this idea that the citizenry should demand that when a company does business in their country, taking advantage of their infrastructure, their workforce, their environment, whatever, they should pay their fair share. And if they don't get to work there. They don't get to have their business license. And the government could operationalize this by estimating how much revenue or business was done by a company in a year in that country, and say, by our laws, here's how much you should pay.
Okay.
And then they can either pay it or they don't get a business license for next year.
So this is a radically different kind of idea. It's almost blackmail taxation.
Absolutely.
It's almost like, look, we're not going to rely upon what you as a company send us, the people, as it were an estimate of how much you owe us. It's more, this is how much we think you sort of make out of us by being here, using our productive activity, selling to us. And so this is just how much you have to pay us. And if not, get the hell out of here. And any assets are now ours.
Exactly.
But this is sort of, that can be dangerous, right?
Well,
to
that's
some people,
the
that'll
problem.
smell like communism or that sort of thing.
Exactly. And that's why one of the other areas of reform, because I think there are many different areas, we write about this all the time, that in some sense need to be recognized as in need of reform simultaneously. Another area is to revive direct democracy, actual control by the people of the machinery of state. Now, at the moment, people will say, well, you vote. Right? Yeah, democracy. You vote in politicians, and so you get the people you say you want. But of course, that's at such a high level, and it's also so sort of infrequent and just not directly addressing the resource allocation decisions that those people will make. And it doesn't allow people to crack into this network of exchange amongst the elites between the government and the companies. It doesn't, that will still be able to operate even in the presence of voting. And often voting happens in a two-party system in many democracies, like Australia, like America. So the extent to which you're really making a choice is very small. So we have proposed this alternative idea where on top of our voting system, you would implement a system whereby the voice of the people is what directs the appointment of people to the tops of the state machinery. So we use, like, for example, the jury system that we have in the criminal law systems of, I'm sure, the Netherlands and Australia, where you're on a jury roll if you're a citizen and of age, and maybe you get called up once or twice and in your lifetime, and you go and you serve on this jury and you determine what is right and wrong in a particular case. Well, in the case of our citizen juries, to appoint the tops of the state bureaucracy, you would be on a roll from age 18, say, and in expectation, one time in your life, you have to serve, maybe with 20 of your peers, on a jury for maybe 2 or 3 months, whose sole objective is to find a person to fill the slot of head of the Department of Education or head of the Department of Immigration, whatever head needs to be filled at that moment, right? Because there's constantly turnover in the headships of these organizations. Somebody will need to be appointed every year or every few months. And of course, at the moment, those are appointments made by politicians. So those are appointments made from within the network. And so you just perpetuate that network of favor exchange, which your PhD student Cameron Murray and yourself have written so brilliantly about for Australia. The book called Rigged, which was the second edition of Game of Mates, How Favors Bleed the Nation, most wonderful subtitle ever of a book. And so, you're basically not affecting what happens in the deep state when you vote, because there's no direct link between the people and the head of the deep state. But you could implement this as a tack-on to the existing system. And that way, when we talk about taxing companies with this kind of tributary taxation or estimated by the state taxation, ideally then it's estimated by a representative of the people rather than a representative of the political class.
So if I could summarize that, you do see the deep state as a thing, as we're heads of the department, but presumably also heads of universities, heads of public media companies, heads of hospitals, as part of almost a ruling class now, but their appointments go via elected politicians, but the elected politicians have sort of been corrupted by big money or the overlords who are no longer taxpayers. Right?
And are themselves often career politicians.
And are themselves career. So in that sense, that's become a single group who in a sense are no longer one of us, no longer citizens.
Exactly.
But you see a new system of appointment out of the hands of even elected politicians, but much more directly into the hands of random citizens.
Yes.
People whom a week beforehand, you don't even know who that's going to be. That's us.
Exactly. And
it's going to be our duty.
It makes it very difficult then to corrupt that group, right? Because you never know who's going to be called up. Right? And so then, and you only do it once. This is the other thing. People say, well, would people take it seriously? If you're only doing it in expectation one time in your life for 2 or 3 months, some countries have military service for years. This is not that much of an ask as an additional service to your community.
Short national service.
And if you look at criminal juries, typically the juries really take their role, their responsibility quite seriously. They work with each other. There's a movie made, 12 Angry Men, about exactly this. And you see the passion and the concern because it's a human life who's
So if you take citizens seriously as citizens, they'll behave more like citizens.
Indeed.
They will become less childish, more adult-like, because you treat them less like
And you give them
children.
permission to take stewardship of their societies.
So existing politicians will hate this, because by design, you're taking away maybe even the biggest power they have. So
welcome to the problem.
Yes, and so the entire megaphone of the legacy media will be against this, ignore it, say how bad it is.
Find all sorts of reasons why it's a bad idea.
But you see this almost as a spear then of sort of this this is a flagship policy which our side could push.
Oh yes, we can
because
absolutely
it will
push
be
for
so
this.
deeply unpopular with everybody who it needs to be unpopular with.
And in some sense, you reveal your colors when you take a stand on whether this is a
Yeah,
reasonable idea to at least pilot, right?
That's right.
Not to say it's perfect, but let's pilot it. And in fact, it is, to an extent, a version or flavor of it being piloted in Australia. We have an organization called New Democracy trying to do very similar things.
So this elevation of the citizenry, starting to see itself again as an owner of the country. Stop asking, give me more of this, which is the childish consumer stuff. More, no, damn it, this place is mine. Do you see that in other areas of life as a necessary solution even to, winning back our country? What else, what other sphere of life do you see this necessary?
Well, to be honest, I think one of the areas of life where it is most necessary to retain your own sanity is in your own psychology, not to be thinking of yourself as a victim. So, the whole woke movement essentially capitalizes on the seductive quality of the having a victim card kind of, appeal, right? Oh, well, can you get more resources by claiming that you are this demography, this
the victim
age,
of the
whatever,
Olympics.
whatever. Exactly.
Who wins?
And that is playing to people's laziness and their selfishness and their kind of just desire to have an easy way to just get more resources towards them, right? Instead, think of the psychological strength you build in yourself when you reject the idea of victimhood, the idea that somebody else is the one in charge and will determine your life, will determine how much money you get, whether or not these taxes will have to be paid. To have that mindset change, it's very empowering. It's very deeply relaxing, really. It gives you a sense of, well, that's all right then. Now I understand. I can run my own life on my own terms in my mind.
Stop complaining what they do to you. Start producing your life, if you like.
And produce it conjunctively with others, right? So, find people you can work with, people you can build trust with, as you and I have found each other, and build together. Exactly. This is a community project.
This is building.
It's a community project. And we don't want, therefore, to lose the power of returns to scale, to have everybody be a Robinson Crusoe fighting for himself. That doesn't work. We are social animals. We need friends. We need community, but we need to take back these communities and strengthen those communities ourselves, because they have weakened over time.
So that's very inspiring. Now, can I zoom out at the grand level again, right? And talk about a topic which you as an American maybe feel a little bit uncomfortable with, which is the importance of the US dollar in international relations. Now, I hear very little talk of that in, as it were, Team Sanity, because it's economics, it's finance. It's difficult. We don't quite know what it is. It can't be important. But the reality is that at least 60% of the transactions which are international, so any two persons buying, whether it's on Amazon or even Rumble or whether it's coffee or oil or Chinese products, most of those transactions are made in US dollars. And most of the international wealth for central banks is in US dollars. And that gives them an enormous advantage, because it means that if the US government prints a lot of US dollars, then everybody loses value in the dollars they've got.
They tax the world.
They tax the world. They tax us. This is a lot of money.
Absolutely, a lot of power.
Can you tell us a bit about how much money the US government, the Federal Reserve, sort of makes doing this, and hence, to a certain extent, just how much the rest of the world gives the US authorities, as it were, if need be? And so how important is this? And do you see that go away? Because I hear lots of voices, Bitcoin is a solution and blah, blah, blah. Is it as simple as that?
I definitely don't think so. On the Bitcoin point, there are people very, very keen on Bitcoin. I think J.D. Vance, who was just named as the VP for Trump, is very big into Bitcoin. I guess I'm kind of on Warren Buffett's side on the Bitcoin argument, which is, where's the fundamental value? What are you building on? It can be eventually corrupted, and it probably already has been corrupted. We just don't know it. I just don't see that there's anything solid in that. With a dollar or with a euro or with some actual currency issued by a sovereign entity, you at least know what the confidence in the currency is built on. It's built upon
Even if you
strength of the country. Of course.
You know who you're distrusting.
You know what the
Bitcoin,
entity is. You knew what the entity is, and it is that entity's power and strength. So in the case of the use of the dollars, the United States' presence in so many different foreign wars and so many different international arenas is in part keeping that alive. It's keeping alive this system of, you're going to have to use our currency. And so showing that strength. I mean, as an American, I have to wince at a lot of our foreign policy. I will say this right now. I don't like it. But in a sense, that equilibrium between the currency value and the fact that it is the currency of choice, the kind of fundamental currency was where the buck stops. It stops at the American dollar. If you're fleeing from some unstable currency, your first choice is the American dollar.
That's still true internationally.
Even
now.
It is, of course.
With all the distrust in the American government.
Because what's the alternative?
To the other ones.
What's the alternative?
Well, I mean, as some friend of mine jokingly said, I want to smash capitalism by trading Bitcoins on an American stock exchange, which is the reality of Bitcoin buying and selling. I know, it's beyond ridiculous. But there are whole political parties who believe this.
I know.
And they believe that they're undermining the US via trading Bitcoins on an American stock exchange. I mean, this is you can't make it up.
But this is equivalent to we have these movements for example, in Australia, where Indigenous peoples will say, we don't like what you've done. We've never ceded our lands to the white colonists, let's say. And I mean, without getting into the history of Australia, the irony is that the reason these people have a voice and can put this opinion is because of the institutions that came together with the colonists and have been built, together with them, for many generations. So, you are using the very institutions that you are railing against. And this is happening in the case of the Bitcoin as well. So this kind of equilibrium between the market for money and the market for power, in some sense, is held together by the various choices that are made by the Federal Reserve, by the State Department and whatnot. And of course, there's a huge amount of taxation that happens, to the government of the United States from this international use of the dollar.
So walk us through that, because I think that my experience has been that people find this very difficult to understand, that somebody who has control of money, whether that's Bitcoin or the US dollar, but somebody who has control of money can somehow tax the people who use it, because they think, well, I've got, euro dollars in my hand. How am I taxed?
Right, but it's inflation.
I've got this. I'm not giving any to anybody else. What do you mean tax?
Yeah. Okay.
Tax is something that happens, at the end of the year. What do you want about?
So the way I would explain this is just using the basics of demand and supply. So for any good, and it could be a dollar, it could be an apple, there's a demand side of the market, and then there's a supply side of the market. The supply side, how many apples are being produced. The demand side, how many people want apples, how many apples are demanded in aggregate across all people who want apples. In the case of a dollar, say that you have a fixed amount of dollars. Say there's $100 circulating in the world. That's a hugely underestimate.
One apple, $1.
Fine, right? So anybody who has a dollar can buy an apple, right? But as soon as the Federal Reserve or whatever the currency issuing body is prints more of those dollars, the supply of dollars goes up. And the demand for those dollars does not necessarily commensurately rise. And as we know, when you have more of something in a market than there is demand for it, what happens? The price of it falls. And so, the Fed can essentially tax people through this inflation. That's what is inflation. It's when you have more supply, more dollars around, then you have economic activity to soak them up. And so prices start rising, and that means your dollar you were holding before will no longer be able to buy a whole apple. Maybe you can buy a half an apple or 3/4 of an apple. And so your buying power has reduced. And in that sense, you have been taxed. The value of something you have held and were holding before has gone down. So it's like you've bought a house and your house loses value. Right? That's in a sense, that's the same thing, but then that value gets taken by the Federal Reserve because the Fed or the government of the United States can use those dollars to pay for things. And so they are essentially taxing you and then using that revenue to pay for whatever they like, foreign wars, the internal domestic expenditure items, education, health, etc.
So to make this as concrete as possible, you sort of say, well, if you have 100 apples in the world and $100 and $1 buys one apple, that's okay. You've got your if you happen to have $1, this is worth an apple. But then the Federal Reserve prints another $100. You suddenly got $200 for the same 100 apples.
Yep.
So twice as much dollars. So one apple is $2. Suddenly, my $1 buys half an apple.
Yes.
And so that $100 which the Fed Reserve printed buys 50 apples. They've suddenly taken away half the goods in the world.
That's right.
That's a lot. 50 apples doesn't sound much, but if you do this, the whole world economy, that can be an enormous amount.
Yep, and of course there are multiple different goods, and we are oversimplifying, but,
Sure.
but in large part, this is what's happened. And so then the amount of goods and services then amassed or amassable by...
So it's like stealing, but it's in a way that's difficult to see.
Clandestine.
Clandestine.
Again.
Okay.
I don't know if I'd say rape, but yeah, clandestine theft.
Yeah.
Theft.
And is this really serious amount of money? I mean, for instance, if I compare this to, let's say, the US defense budget, which as we know is huge, right? The US spends more money on defense and security services than something like the next 10 countries together, right? I mean, that's an enormous industry, right? We all think, but is the amount that they manage to steal via printing money even more than this in a year?
Yes.
So more than
they're already spending, they're already creating through this mechanism of money printing and having everybody else be able to be taxed because their effective tax base is so much bigger.
Unseen to most of us, this is bigger than the US defense budget. Yeah. Which is, I mean, I doubt that most viewers would believe this, right? It's sort of like, this is unseen, we don't see it.
It's hidden.
But you're saying this is so important. So if it were true, well, to a certain extent, is this why the US defense budget is so big, to have all these foreign bases to, nudge the foreign governments into keeping using the dollars?
The more people use the dollars, the more the tax base increases. Okay. So it's a kind of imperialist strategy, if you want to think of it that way, which isn't common to...
Keep using our dollar because we're taxing you in a way you don't see.
Exactly.
We're slowly raping and stealing from you.
And you can't, and there's kind of almost nothing to fight against. Because as soon as you start fighting against the local American base, you've got the whole of America that's going to clamp down on you, right?
And if you use Bitcoin, you're just helping America again, because that's where the stock markets
in America.
are.
It's traded there.
And who pays for the advertisements? Mainly Americans again. So in a way, that's not
the people who are getting screwed by this whole system.
It's part of the problem. That's right.
So the Americans themselves, again, there's a distinction between the elites and the people on the street in America, right? And so those people themselves are losing in terms of their goods and services, the value of their dollars, and this inequality that then gets bigger and bigger and has increased since, far pre-COVID, but it's gotten that much worse during COVID. That's a real social destabilizer as well, for all sorts of other reasons.
So use the Swiss francs then. At least, if the money goes to somebody else, at least you're not...
Have it not be the hegemon.
let it not fund the American army or some American stock exchange controller, basically, right? Or some unknown bunch of people. Okay, that's very interesting. So then I want to talk about, if we see this whole feudal system, you called it, right? The new overlords, as if we are in the Middle Ages. If that collapses because the elite splits, or the West loses a huge war like the current one in Ukraine, or maybe the one that will be started with Russia and China, and the people lose confidence in it entirely, the EU collapses, all that. I mean, what do you imagine that? Is that a collapse which you say, that's great, the end of government? Or that's rather scary, right? The collapse of government.
It's bloody. It's stressful. It's demoralizing. It's essentially a fracture of most of the civilization. That's not good. That's not a good thing. Not to say that that might not in fact happen, and that many of the things that we're seeing now, the war in Ukraine and whatnot, are sort of moving us further towards that trajectory. But do I wish for the current national governments of the world to collapse under the weight of their own sclerotic bureaucracy and elite capture and corruption? I don't wish that, because that is a bloody and destructive future. So what I prefer to think of, we don't want world government either. We were supposed to talk about one world government. We don't want that. A, because it's a fantasy. B, because it's of course corruptible itself and will necessarily be pushing towards a reduction in innovation, a reduction in human freedom, a reduction in all the things that cause long-term growth and thriving. So for all sorts of reasons, that's bad. But if we go to the next layer of governments, the nations, destroying them is not going to ultimately further the human condition. What we need is renewal and reform, and sometimes alternative systems to show that we can do this differently. So in health, for example, we haven't spoken about this. We're doing this new system in education, Nova Academia. We're trying something new in higher education. Similarly in health, in Australia, I'm speaking with several people in the freedom movement on what would the blueprints look like for a new side version. So it wouldn't replace national health care in Australia, which we have. It comes to everybody. But it would be an alternative that you could pay into as a premium, and then you could get alternative kinds of health services that are not presently approved of by the medical authorities, which are very bureaucratic and very much aligned with, these sort of mainstream principles. So you could, for example, get vitamin C infusions for your cancer, or you could get ivermectin for your COVID, or you could get many things. But we need to figure out a way to make that accessible to Australians and have doctors who have reliability protection that's adequate, who are empowered to actually treat the patient in front of them instead of following protocols. There are a lot of things to work out for this blueprint, but having that as an addition rather than saying, destroy the entire healthcare system now.
Well, and our side doesn't have remotely the power.
Indeed.
But to summarize that, you do see this one world agenda still being pushed.
Oh, yes.
But at the moment, it has, as it were, captured the national institutions. And almost like a parasite, it sort of latches onto them. It does all the top appointments. And you have a vision of how citizens should replace those kind of systems. But you're worried that if this is a sudden collapse, then we're like in Somalia, sort of horrible
chaos. Absolutely.
Chaos and huge,
and worse
huge
than Somalia.
disruption.
Worse in some ways, because we have the people who are alive today, for the most part, have been completely habituated to just dependence and apathy. And so they wouldn't even know what to do, where to start, what's the first step, how do we rebuild? I mean, it would be catastrophic.
It would be catastrophic. So in a way, you want the globalist one world government project to fail, but you don't want it to crash, if you like. And in the meanwhile, you want whom to sort of think of new side health institution, which will be bitterly resisted by this whole parasitical class, will be seen as the enemy.
Absolutely, because it is the enemy. It is the enemy in a sense, from their perspective. Now, if you're on the side of humanity, you're on the side of humanity, it's not the enemy.
But if there's no blooming on the side, then it's kind of crash or burn. Right? Or in a way, it cuts down the growth of sort of organic alternatives, which make it livable even for themselves, for their own children.
Yes.
Then it's kind of an all or nothing casino,
gamble.
So that sort of forces everybody to stay on the same boat.
Yes, no, I
which
know.
sort of forces a crash or not.
Exactly,
right?
and that's again, forcing on the same boat is a good way to think about it, right?
Yeah.
That's never been a recipe for long-term sustainable human thriving and growth, is to say everybody has to use this one system, this one way, this one approach. There needs to be room for experimentation. There needs to be room for trying some different way. And we've talked about this as well as an alternative to the education systems that we have now and the funding systems, the research funding systems, to say, okay, governments, you must allocate X amount of money to new schools of thought. As a protective mechanism.
That's again the what would happen once sanity breaks out.
Of course.
But that one boat, I mean, two things are interesting to explore there. One is this: is there an alternative, even for the people who are now increasingly surveilled and sort of monitored and under restrictive regulations, and every means of local escape is sort of made impossible? Is there still? I mean, can you choose something else? What would the escape look like?
Well, I mean, I think it depends very much on where you are, but you've already mentioned you can use Swiss francs to do your currency transactions.
Yep.
You can build up
they'll try and smash that.
Of course
they will. That illegal
they will. But you can join organizations that are pushing for new systems, new solutions, new approaches, and form new networks of trust. Right? Because the trust network,
that's like trying to survive on the side in a way. We're heavily repressed.
For now, yes, that's true. Because, I mean, either you do that or you say, and I've seen some people on the resistance in Australia do this. They say, look, I'm going to hold my nose and run for an office in one of the big parties.
Yeah.
And you just, they hope, they throw their energies into this, and they think, well, maybe I can make a difference. And I've seen this happen so many times. People get there, and the amount by which they can move the dial just by having been sane at the start is so minimal. And it's just them against this massive machine.
You lie in hope.
Yeah,
you lie
indeed.
In hope. And you go along with most of the lies, hoping you can change
one small thing.
Which is terrible for the soul.
It's just so demoralizing.
It is demoralizing. You have to lie all day. At a certain moment, you almost can't live with yourself unless you don't mind the lie so much.
I could never do this. I know I could never do this personally.
What about migration? What about just saying, look,
of course.
Forget about trying to survive in that system. I'm off to Paraguay.
If you have the means to move your family.
Okay.
So the young people who are looking to the future, they want to find a place to raise their children, just like any other human migration patterns. We see that, when I teach my kids labor economics, we study human migration patterns as a first thing, because that tells you...
And that's how America started, people escaping Europe, right?
Yes, but I teach in Australia.
Escape the crashing ship, as it were.
That's it. But again, it's mainly the people who will be looking for a future for themselves, for their kids. So you're not expecting the 65-year-olds necessarily to be the vanguard of this.
But there is an out. There is an out.
For the young people, there is always an out.
Okay. So then finally talk me for, maybe 1 or 2 minutes, a quick what would this alternative health institution look like? If you're surviving within the ship, particularly here in Europe, it's very oppressive, right? In America, at least, you can go to Florida, Texas, there's more choice. But here, particularly the Netherlands also, it's incredibly censorious.
Yes.
It's oppressive. You put on the radio, you feel oppressed.
I can imagine.
It's absolutely amazing, the propaganda here.
And the idea that these systems actually do promote health is so farcical.
It's difficult to live.
So the key observation is that you need to escape the clutches of this bureaucracy, the current bureaucracy, which means...
difficult to do.
Well, it's difficult to do on home soil.
Yeah.
Right. So then you need to think, okay, where else could we do this? And you already see this happening. People have, very frequently, I know, gone to other countries, medical tourism, to get various procedures.
Medical tourism.
So you
go to the ocean.
So you link up with something that's not
islands,
on the sovereign territory. And of course, you also try to give the consumer more choice. So at the moment, it's very difficult. You often have one specialist who says this. Getting a second opinion is hard. So figure out a way to use modern technology to provide multiple different options for a patient who's not sure, and then have them able to choose. So
medical
there's many
tourism, either
aspects.
going there or letting it come to you via the internet, whatever way you can find. Very interesting.
Yeah, well, watch the space.
Is there any final message you want to give to our viewers? Because we covered a lot of ground. So you've given us the benefit of your...
I really would encourage people not to give up hope. I would encourage them not to waste themselves, waste their energy by becoming cynical, by becoming depressed, by becoming obsessive, by indulging in one particular, this is the one thing that matters. Those things, that's a negative direction to move into. Try to retain
very
health.
American. I still believe in a place called hope.
Look, it's important.
Okay.
Forgive me for being American, but for me, this is something that's enabled me to stay spirited and energetic for 4 years of fighting this nonsense. And things are happening. Good things are happening. We have so many more resistance organizations now that are doing good things, that are creating change, that are pushing against nonsense effectively. And you can't give up on humanity.
No, definitely. We need to keep believing in the good parts of humanity. Feed that.
Exactly.
Try to forgive the bad parts of ourselves.
Think of the things we've done together at our best moments. We are an amazing, unbelievable, awesome species, and we need to elevate our understanding of that and unlock our potential, and also, of course, be very aware of our weaknesses and build institutions.
Feed the best in ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Feed the best, but yet acknowledge the worst, and build institutions that accommodate that.
It's there. Thank you very much for visiting the Netherlands, and we hope to have the benefit of your teaching in Nova Academia and all the other activities that you are part of nationally and internationally. Thank you very much, Gigi Foster.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it. Thank you.
It's very good. Thank you.